Okay, so everyone can see the title slide for this presentation. Yeah, okay, awesome. Lost my notes, there they are. Okay, so as everyone knows from the title of this workshop, that this is about data organization and data management. And the way I'm going to frame this is talking about the different sort of levels at which you can think about your data. And then the end result will be a checklist that will hopefully be a useful guide, at least a place to start with your data. And so again, as I said, these are all intended to very much be suggestions or a possible place to start. None of this is intended to be prescriptive or like this is how you have to do it. Because as we all know, with each of our different data sets, there's a lot of context dependency around them. You know, the specifics of the project you're working on, the specifics of how the data was collected matter a lot. And then also whatever is standard in your field, oftentimes is the thing that you should possibly go with, because that's what other researchers in your area will be expecting. So again, this is not like you have to do it this way, just some ideas, basically. And so one thing that at least I get overwhelmed sometimes thinking about all the things I could be doing with my data. And so having a focus on progress, not perfection, is really helpful too. Like, you know, each time you work with a new data set or a new project, like improving your process a little bit, adding a little bit of extra on there, but not feeling compelled to like do all the things all at once, because that can be really overwhelming. Okay, and this, everything that we're talking about is mostly going to be focused on flat files. So just files with rows and columns. We won't be really going into more hierarchical data types like netcdfs. That's kind of a whole different ballgame, although some of these principles do still apply. And there are two themes that I'll try to keep coming back to throughout is consistency and documentation are the two things that I really think make your data organization better. Okay. So the way that I've sort of structured thinking about about a data set is to think about it at these three different levels. So there's the contents of a data file. So how is it organized within the data file? It's thinking about sort of the data file itself. And then it's also thinking about collections of data files. So usually in projects, we'll end up having multiple data files that are associated with one another and sort of what to do about organizing those. So you'll see these three little icons throughout the rest of the presentation. And as I said, the thing that we're going to try to build up here basically is this checklist of that you can use for different data sets or different projects. Basically, it's a way of saying, okay, which of these things am I doing? Which of these things do I want to start doing or apply to my data? And so we again have these three categories, these different levels to think about our data at. And I'm going to use a snippet of a data set, an example basically, to illustrate some of the concepts that I'll talk about to make it more clear, hopefully. And so this is going to be example data, but from a real data set that our group is involved with. So this data comes from a site that's in Maricopa, Arizona, so near Phoenix. So you can see that like on the map right here on the left-hand side. And basically what is at that site is this field that you can see this image of. It's a long skinny field just out in the desert. And that field has been split up into a bunch of different equal sized plots. There's 800 something plots. And so at that field, they grow different plants, do different experiments on those plants. The data, the snippet of data, which is just a few observations we're looking at, will be for sorghum, if you've ever even heard of that before. And then oftentimes the way that the experiments are done is that in each of these subplots, they'll grow different subspecies and then look at the differences between them. And so the things that they look at for the plants, they look at a lot of different characteristics of plants and the way that those characteristics are measured. Some of them are done by hand or by different machines, but the main one is there's this big robot here that's called the gantry, and you can see it in this image too. It's pretty big. It basically goes through the field and it scans the different plants and then measures different characteristics of them. And so it measures things like the size of the plants, the structure. It shoots lasers at them to figure out, you know, like how the different leaves and things are shaped. I'm not a plant ecologist, so some of it's a little beyond me, but it is a really cool piece of technology. So that's the data set that we're taking our example data out of. And like I said, we're only going to use, oh, and this is a reference for the data. It's called TerraRef. but we're only going to use a few observations from that data set as example data. And so this is the actual example data that I'll use to illustrate some of these data principles. And so just to talk about the contents of this data. So we have 3 observations. They're all from season 4 for this project. And there are, I think, 9 seasons overall. Like I said, it's organized into different plots in the field. And so the plots are indicated by these row and column variables. There's the date on which a particular observation was collected. And then we have 2 variables that were measured. And so this project measured way more variables than this. I just picked out a couple that are fairly straightforward. So biomass is basically the amount of plant material that is above ground in a particular plot. And then the canopy height is how tall, like the tallest part of the plant is. So yeah, we're basically just gonna use this like snippet, this subset of a much bigger data set to illustrate some of these ideas. Okay, and so I'll maybe stop there for a second, see if anyone has any questions before we start actually going into the principles and the ideas. Okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna start off building up basically this checklist piece by piece. And so the first thing we're gonna start with is we're gonna start with the contents of your data files and how those are arranged. And so the first idea that we're gonna talk about, which is part of the title of this workshop, is tidy data. So what is tidy data? Basically, this is a concept that is an approach for how you can organize your data in a more standardized way. And basically by using this approach, by doing this process of taking your messy data and turning it into tidy data, is that it will make the data easier for your computer to work with, but it's also straightforward for a human to look at and understand. And so by putting your data into the standardized approach, it can make it a lot easier to clean and analyze individual data sets. And then also if you do this consistently across all your data, it's much easier for you or other people to understand like basically what data is available and how it's organized. And so tidy data is basically the collection of these 3 rules right here about how to organize your data. So each variable should have its own column, each observation has its own row, and then each value has its own cell. And so actually, because of the way these concepts work together, you really only have to apply 2 out of the 3 to sort of get the 3rd automatically in there. And I'll walk through with our example data, actually show you how, like examples of how to do this, or when your data might not be tidy. Okay, so for the first principle from tidy data, you want 1 variable per column. And so you'll see right here we have our example data, and this is in a messy format, and then this is in the tidy version of that. And so in the messy version of that, you can see there's a column for plot that kind of includes 2 different variables within it. And so this is something you see, I mean, I see this fairly often in data sets, and you probably do too, where there are actually two or more pieces of information that are all sort of squished together into 1 column. And so when you see that, it's good principle to then separate those all out into individual columns. Because while I can look at that and see what that means, for example, if I wanted to, actually like plot some of this data by having my plot information all in 1 column like that, it'll make it really, really hard because the computer sees that as 1 unit, 1 piece of information. So yeah, anytime you look at an individual cell and say, hey, there's like more than 1 piece of information in here, it might be a sign that you have multiple variables in 1 column. So split those out like this is done here. The second sort of rule behind tidy data is to have 1 row per observation. And so what does that mean? So here we have our messy data on the top and then the sort of tidy version of that data on the bottom. And so originally in the data set, you saw that we have 1 observation, which is, in each plot on each date, what were the measurements that were taken? So here we have biomass and canopy height. But you could imagine this data set could be in a messy version like this one right here, where they took each observation and split it across 2 rows. And so now you have biomass in 1 row and canopy height in another row. But these are all actually still 1 observation. They're all taken at the same time, same place, on the same individuals. And so if you see cases like that, that might be a case where you're going to rearrange your data so that you make sure you only have one observation per row in your data set. And then that, again, will make it easier to work with. Because right now, kind of the way this is set up, it kind of makes, it'll make your computer think these are kind of two different things. Okay, and then the third principle is one value per cell. And so if you are adhering to the first two rules, one variable per column, one row per observation, the result will be that you will end up with one value per cell. So like I said, if you see cells that have multiple values per them, that might be a sign that you need to look at your data structure again. Okay, and the last sort of component of this is also, it's generally good principle to try not to have any empty cells. So one value per cell, no, you want to have no like empty cells that have nothing in them. And so the reason that this is a generally suggested concept is that when you have an empty cell, there's some ambiguity there. You don't know whether it's because there was no data taken at all for some reason for that particular instance, or if somebody just like was entering this data by hand and skipped over that cell by accident. And so by putting in an actual value there, like NA, and we'll talk about missing values in a second, but if you make sure to put an actual representation that there's missing data there, now there's no ambiguity. People know that for that particular observation and that particular variable, that there's just no, we don't have data for that. It's not that it was skipped over on accident. Okay, so that's sort of the tidy data principles part of this. I don't know if people were familiar with this before or not, or if people have questions about that. I mean, it's definitely one of those things that it's helpful like to practice, and you sort of, as you tidyify your data more, you then will be able to see more easily with new data sets kind of how they can be turned into that tidy format. Okay, Heidi asks, so a long data set isn't tidy, but it's still useful for some plots and analyses, right? Yeah. Okay, no, I can see what you're saying now. That's a good question, because a long data set is kind of like the preferred format within like, you know, the tidyverse and stuff.
Well, I jump back and forth all day long, but I'm kind of wondering now, like, why I do that, or, you know, because I know I need to know about long data, but why?
Because well, to be honest, I think that's maybe because that's how the tools in are. And so if you're not, for folks who are not R users, sorry about this, but yeah, having those data sets long are useful for doing things like using ggplot to plot them. But then that's not considered tidy data. So which of the formats are like preferred?
Readable. Yeah, right.
The long format, yeah. Because it's doing that thing, it's breaking up observations across different rows.
The program is rower color. Yeah. Maybe just having the tidy data in the first place makes it really easy to get to the long format or a different format. So then it's just a good place to start.
Yeah, so I guess like the pipeline for working with like tidyverse tools in particular would be taking your original raw data set, cleaning it up into a tidy format, but then when you're actually going and plotting it, you'd want to turn it into that long format. So it's an extra step in there. But yeah, but by making it long, I think that's why it took me a long time to understand what a long format was. And yeah, whether program's row or column based. Yeah, that's probably the case. Because I think there are usually intermediary steps then between like sort of your cleaned data and then the data that's like ready to go into your analysis program or your plotting program. So yeah, that's a good thought. And I feel like I need to Google that. I feel like there's probably some like good blog posts out there about switching back and forth between like a tidy format and a long format. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, and again, I'm not an expert on any of this. Yeah, so these are all good things for me to think about too, my own data. Okay, so if no one else has any thoughts right now, we'll move on for the moment. But again, feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so there's some more concepts that you can think about in terms of organizing your data sort of within a data set. And so there's some tips here about how to think about your columns. And so one of the first things to think about with your columns is naming your columns, so naming those variables. And so there's a balance between wanting to have shorter column names that don't go on forever and ever and ever, but then also making sure you have enough information in them. Like if you just name a column T, you may not actually know what T stands for later on. This is a really hard thing to do. It's more of an art form. And yeah, I constantly go back and forth between like short names and then names with a little more information in them. So it's definitely a tricky thing. Another thing that's generally recommended with your columns is to try to only have one header row for each of your columns. So you can see I took our example data and then I added a second header row that includes the variables for, or sorry, the units for some of the variables. That is generally not considered good practice. And then later on, when you try to use a program to clean and analyze your data, that can just make it more difficult to work with. And we'll talk a little bit more about different options for what to do with your units in a minute too. For columns of data that are categorical data, try to stick to using consistent categories. And so I see this all the time. If you work with other people's data, you've probably seen it too. Things like if, for example, people are doing research on mice and they have male and female mice, you would see a column of sex, but male and female could be represented by, you know, lowercase m, uppercase M, male spelled out all the way, male with a capital M. And so, yeah, like, and this is part of the data cleaning process, is sometimes going through and figuring out where, you know, people use different actual strings, but for the same category. But if you can sort of, you know, make sure at least when you're collecting your data, that's all in consistent formats, it makes things a lot easier later on. Because the computer sees those as different things, right? Like a computer will see small m and big M is like, those are two different categories. But in reality, we know as humans, those are the same thing. So, okay, and yeah, as I said about units, so units for your different columns. So it is good principle to try to have either all of your values within the same column, using the same unit, or alternatively, if you have the same variable, but some of the values are in different units, you can do kind of what I've represented here, which is have a separate column that indicates the units for each of the variables. And so this is a pretty clear and explicit way of showing or documenting the units that your variables were measured in. And so yeah, here we have biomass where 2 of the observations were measured in grams, 1 was measured in milligrams for whatever reason. This is not real, by the way, I just made this up. But yeah, so we have this extra column here that specifies what the units are. Or alternatively, if it's all the same unit, then I'll talk about documentation in a minute, which is another place you can specify what units your data are in. And again, consistency is one of the things that sort of helps solve a lot of these problems. Okay, yeah, so I mentioned missing data earlier. So again, with the whole consistency theme, so when you have missing data, when you have those cells that have no content in them because you weren't able to measure something for some reason, there was a rainstorm, or I used to help sometimes with collecting rodents, and sometimes we wouldn't have their mass because they would escape and run away from us. It's good to make sure that you're using a consistent value to represent your missing data. And this can vary depending on field, depending on programs that you're using. I know NA or NAN are common ones, but there's probably others out there that I'm not aware of. And then also try hard not to use possible values, like realistic value or realistic-ish values for your missing data representation. And so I've seen this in data sets where you have numeric data, and then the missing data is represented by like -9999. And then if you actually, you know, the computer sees that as a number, it's not going to say, hey, this is the missing value. It's going to say, hey, this looks like a number to me, so I'm going to treat it like a number. And so that can mess up all your analyses. So, and again, like I said earlier, blank cells can be ambiguous. And so try to fill in all of your blank cells with something, or they might actually be blank because they're, if someone forgot to fill them in, and then you're like, oh, hey, somebody needs to go back and look at the original data sheet and like fill in that value. And then, yeah, actually, so, and I've had some conversations with someone about this recently because we were trying to run a model and it required the data for the places where there was missing data to have blanks in it. And so in my mind, it was, okay, well, we're going to clean up the data. We're going to put NAs in where there's missing data, but then there's going to be a next step where we replace all those NAs with blanks, but specifically for putting the data into the model. And so our sort of clean version of the data still had, a missing data representation that was not a blank. So in my mind, that's like a compromise between the, between the two. Dates. Okay. Yeah, this, if you work with any sort of time series data, you've probably dealt with a headache that are dates. And this is something that dates themselves, we've taught whole workshops on. Jessica's taught an entire workshop on how to deal with dates because it can be very, very tricky and a huge pain. Again, I'm not an expert. I've only dabbled in it, but one of the recommendations is for your dates to try to use the ISO standard, which is the year, dash, month, dash, day. But again, like I've said, consistency is the most important thing. So however you format your dates, do it that way across, at least within a data set across, the entire thing. Okay, be clear with relative dates. This is a little less useful for this. So I presented on this material before for an agricultural group. So some of the examples are more specific to them. But yeah, so at least in some of the agricultural fields, they use a lot of relative dating. They'll do things like, days after planting. But then if you don't know what the date of planting was, you have no idea when the day after planting happened. So just being clear with all of those, making sure you have all of the information needed for somebody to actually figure out what a date is. And then, yeah, be careful with Excel. Excel does some really weird things with date things. It'll turn things that aren't dates into dates. It'll take things that are supposed to be dates and like put them in weird, funky formats. So just if you're using Excel, double and triple check. If you're going back and forth between Excel and another format, like just double and triple check that it hasn't mangled your dates in some way. So, and I included a screenshot here of a one of the sort of commonly known articles about Excel screwing up data in research. This isn't really specifically related to dates, but yeah, they had this example of where these gene names were interpreted as just really large scientific notation by Excel. So Excel is a useful tool, but it also can be very painful. Okay. So that's everything for the sort of like within a data file, the contents of a data file that I was going to cover. And actually I'll go to this. So this is the first part of our checklist is now filled out. We have all of these different sort of concepts or principles that I went over. Yeah, if you have any questions or thoughts about any of that before we move on. You can see the consistency. I think that word shows up a lot in this entire checklist. So, okay. Well, so we'll go on to talking about more about like data files themselves and what to do with them. Beyond just like what's inside of them. Okay, so if you're following tidy data principles, most of the time you'll end up with consistency is definitely important. If you're following those tidy data principles, you oftentimes end up with a complete rectangular format for your data file. But you'll oftentimes see things like this. You've probably done it, I've done it before, where people leave blank rows in order to indicate something about the data has changed. So for example, this is a blank row inserted between the row 1 of data and then the row 2. And while this can be nice for humans to read it, again, this is something that is not great for a computer to be able to read. And so for your sort of final clean version of your data set, it's a good idea to get rid of these rows that are all just entirely blank. And then you can see there's a couple of blank cells here that should be filled in with something, either NAs or actual values. Okay, I see some stuff in the chat. Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, so sorry. Yeah. Wesley said it's hard to be consistent when you figure something out after the fact and have to go back and change everything. Yeah. And it can be really, really painful. And part of this is just the process of learning. If you're collecting your own data, part of it is the process of learning how the format you put your data in when you collect it is oftentimes very different than the format that you eventually need it in, due to constraints of how you're collecting your data. And then sometimes you don't have any control over it. You're just given data that's not yours. That's going to be in like a really funky format. And so sometimes just sitting down and trying to develop a plan for what you're going to do with that data before you actually start working on it, it can be helpful, so that you don't then like partially clean it up and then try to work with it and realize it's not going to work and have to go back. But this iterative cycle of like going back and re-cleaning and changing the format a little bit, like, I mean, I don't know, it feels almost endless sometimes. So yeah.
That's the reason why Kristina and I have jobs. I feel like we joke a lot about, we joke amongst ourselves like, man, the stuff we keep teaching and people keep learning it, we're going to teach ourselves out of a job. And somehow we have not yet taught ourselves out of a job. So
there'll always be present. Yeah, there's always going to be data that's super hard to finagle like into a useful format. So yeah, I feel the pain on that. Yeah. Missing values are automatically filled in R with NA. I think if you use, wow. Yeah, I think if you use the reader package in R to read in like CSVs that have blanks, I think it'll automatically fill them in with NAs. And if they're not, then there are also tools in R that you can use to fill it in the blanks with NAs. So yeah. Good questions, good thoughts. Okay. So yeah, one of the signs of having a nice data set, nice cleaned up data set, is it ends up in a sort of finished rectangular form. Every row, every column has something in it, only one thing in it. Naming your data file, just like naming your variables, is hard to do. You want to have a long enough name for your data file that you know what it is, but also short enough, because if it's just like, you know, if you've got thousands of character long names, like that's just still going to be really hard for you to understand what's going on. Oh, and additionally, try to not have any spaces in your file names. This is more for the computer than for you. So use camel case or dashes instead of spaces. And I meant to mention that too with variable names. It's better if you name your variables with no spaces in the name. Okay, so when you have a data file and you have all these columns in it, one of the things that you need to do then is to provide some documentation for what those columns are, beyond just the column name. So the column name, it's important to think about what each of those variable names is and try to do a good job naming them. But then additionally, it's helpful to have something like this data dictionary that documents those variables. And so this is basically a separate file, a text file that contains the names of all the variables. Each variable has a description of what it is and then includes the units if relevant. And so yeah, you can see here the biomass and canopy height have units specified. And that this would be the case if every single observation for that variable is using the same unit. And so it's good practice to start thinking about, like, when you have a data file, probably each of those data files should have a data dictionary. It's a little bit of extra work, and they do take maintenance too, because as you clean your data, the contents of your data file or your data dictionary might have to change to reflect those changes. So they can be a little onerous to maintain. Yeah, this is an example of a data file or a data dictionary for this example data that we've been looking at. So you can see the observation or the variable names and then descriptions of each of them. So file formats. This is a whole different thing that, like, you know, we could probably spend a lot of time thinking about. Again, I'm not an expert on it per se, but just be thinking about what types of file formats you're choosing and why. There is no like perfect right thing to use. Some people will tell you like, oh, you always need to use CSVs or something. Don't listen to people who are that prescriptive, because it depends a lot on your data and it depends a lot on your field. So things to think about are using file formats that are not as accessible to people because they require special software to open. And you can think about things like Excel or Word docs, which you don't need the Microsoft suite to open. You can use free programs to open. And so like all these things can be really complicated, but yeah, so can people easily open and access your data with a free program, or do they need something that they have to pay for? Another thing is persistency of your file format. So is this a file format that's been used for a while, that's going to keep being used, or at some point is your data going to basically be lost to history? I think of my undergrad advisor. He had like old, like whatever a pre of floppy disk is, he had like stacks of those in his lab that like he didn't have a machine to read anymore, but he was hesitant to throw them away because it was a lot of work to collect all of the data that was on there. So stuff to think about. And yeah, like I said, it depends a lot on your field, the conventions that other people use, and then what's sort of accessible now versus accessible long-term. These are all hard questions to answer, but it's good to think about them. So.
Kristina, sorry.
Hi, yeah.
Wesley has a question about where do you keep your data dictionary?
Yeah. So maybe the sort of simplest thing to do is that wherever you have your data on some folder in your computer. You can also have a separate file, like a text file or Word doc, if that's what you're used to using. That's also in the same folder with the data file, and then has probably a similar name, or maybe like the name and then underscore data dictionary or something like that. And then I'll talk about READMEs in a little bit too, which is basically a way of compiling at a higher level documentation about your project, including all your data files. And so that's another place where a data dictionary can go. So yeah, and I don't per se advocate for this, but I've seen people have Excel spreadsheets where they have the data in one tab, and then they have a second tab or spreadsheet, I guess they're called, a second spreadsheet that they put their data dictionary into. And that's nice because they're like together, right? Like they're like a combined whole. And I think that's better than not having a data dictionary, right? Like having that documentation. But yeah, the sort of the easiest thing I think of is having, your data file in whatever format, and then, in the same folder, having a text file with your data dictionary in it. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Yes, and there are always a lot of folders and files. Yeah, so this is a problem with like, okay, if you have a data dictionary per each data file, then like you're like starting to accumulate a lot. And so I'll talk a little bit later about like a research compendium and thinking about how to structure your project as a whole. It's a little outside the scope of this in particular, but once you start getting a lot of data and a lot of files, starting to think about how to organize those in a more efficient way can be really helpful. So I see a link here. To Notion, which we had someone use on one of our projects. Do you want to talk, Megan, a little bit about how you're using it? I only use it to help plan an event, so.
I use only the free version, and it's like having your own database, but it's all in the same little program. And I have it on my phone, on my iPhone. I have it on my desktop, and so I can like get to all of the stuff at the same time. So like I just have one little database for like projects I'm working on, and then you can put a link within this to different pages, and the different pages could be things that link to like a PDF, or it could be things that link to a spreadsheet. And so it's really helpful because I am very disorganized. So having it all, knowing it's all in Notion somewhere instead of just like in my desk or in my computer.
And I assume you can do some sort of like sub projects or folders or something in here. Yeah. So you could have like one area where you have like this project and then all the files associated with it, like that sort of thing.
Yep, absolutely. And you can share these things with people. Again, with accessibility, they would have to like give an email, but again, they wouldn't have to pay anything to have access to it. So
nice. Well, it looks like it has a nice interface too. Yes. So, and they would be seeing exactly what you're seeing, as opposed to if they like,
exactly
had a downloaded the same folder onto their computer, it might like look a little different. So
right, and there would be no downloading of that stuff if they,
yeah, it's on the browser.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. I've been hearing more about Notion, and I feel like more people have been using it. So I know that's something we should think about for our projects. And I assume it syncs across all your different platforms automatically, right?
Yep. It's really nice.
Nice. So yeah, that might be a helpful tool for people. Oh yeah, we got another nod for Notion. Awesome. Okay. Oh, no, I don't remember where I was. Oh yeah, we were talking about data dictionaries and Notion and the concept of organizing your projects. Yeah, which is challenging. It's never easy. Okay. Oh, and okay. So I mentioned file formats. Just think about your file formats. There's a lot of things to think about. Yeah, it's a challenging thing sometimes. Okay. So if you have a data set that, you know, you have some big data set and you notice that you have a lot of repeated data in some of the same columns, that could be a suggestion that you want to take your one big data set, and it could be helpful to split it up into multiple different data sets that are related. So a relational database. And so that might sound kind of esoteric until I hopefully can make it more clear with this example using our example data. So our original example data are these observations with the season, row, column, date, biomass, canopy height. But I added in here for additional columns of information. So the latitude, longitude, and the start date and the end date. But you can see these added columns all have the same information in them. And that's because the latitude and longitude and the start and end date are by site, not by observation. So they're the same thing for all the observations in this data set. And so that could be an indicator to you that, oh, like there's no reason to have the same repeated information. I could pull out these columns and put them into their own sites data set, and then have the separate observations data set. And so then that's a way of sort of making it easier to look at each of the data sets. They're a little simpler and they don't have all this repeated information clogging them up. But then you have to know how these are related. So what links these two data sets? And in this case, it's the season. And so if you want then to include all of this site level information or season level information with your observations, you'd have to join this data back together again. So whether or not it's worth the hassle of like splitting up your data into multiple data sets and then possibly having to combine them depends a lot on your project. But it can be a helpful thing to do. But then, yes, you also want to document the keys, the columns that these relational databases are built off of. So yeah, and oftentimes the keys between the different data sets in a bigger relational database are the time or the location. Okay, what else about data files? Oh, back up your data files. I think we all know this. We probably all experienced some painful experiences with losing data. But yeah, try to put your data in at least 2 locations, and it helps, and possibly more. And it helps if you have, you know, like one is on the cloud, like in Google Drive or something like that, and maybe another is on some sort of physical media computer or hard drive. So yeah, one of these things that, again, it takes work, right? Like it's not trivial to do this. And so we don't always do it for all of our data files. But if you have a data file that only exists on your computer and nowhere else, and your computer falls into a lake, then that data is gone forever. And that's really sad. So, okay. And the last thing about your data files, yeah, worst nightmare. I did spill a glass of water on a computer when I was working at Oak Ridge National Lab. Luckily, my boss just laughed when I told him, and we didn't lose anything important, but it was really scary. Thought I was going to get in a lot of trouble. Yeah, so it's a good idea to choose a license for your data. So if your data isn't publicly available, you don't necessarily need a license because no one's going to come along and try to use it. But hopefully your data is open if it can be. And in that case, you're going to want a license so that other people know how they can use it. And it's better to do this ahead of time than to have someone come along and use it and then try to figure out later on. And so the purpose of a license is to sort of specify how people can get credit for using the data set and then what they can do to use or reuse it. And so there's a couple good places to look for licenses. There's Creative Commons. That's probably like the big one. They've got a bunch of different, and they're pretty good about spelling out like what the different licenses are about. But they've got a bunch of different licenses based on the different types of permissions you want to give. And then the most permissive one that they offer is the CC0. So that's the one that I'm seeing more and more people using. So another resource for licenses for data is Open Data Commons. And I know less about those licenses, but it's another one that pops up pretty regularly. So yeah, and I think a license is not something necessarily you need to sit around and like worry about or bang your head against. I think, you know, there's only a few options of what is reasonable. So, but it's a good thing to do. Okay, so we'll stop and take a minute again. So that's all of the stuff at the second level of like, okay, when you have a data file, how do you think about it? What do you do with it? How do you make it easier to use? So again, with this consistency, having a data dictionary and making sure to back up your data are some of the big things. And again, it's easy to say these things, doing them takes work. So like, yeah, it's easy to look at this list and be like, why don't I already do all of this for all my data files? And it's because, you know, we all have limited time and resources. So. Okay, so I just started with my dog. The last level that we'll talk about is collections of data files. So within a project, you might have a handful of data files. And it's good to think about what to do with those and how to make them work together well. So the first thing is that if you have multiple data files, like we have 2 data files here, for example, 2 different seasons, is to try to make sure consistency. You're using the same variable names for the same variables. So here, this data set uses biomass. This one, which is the same variable, but it's labeled AGB for above ground biomass. And so that's a case where it'd be a good idea to just pick one and use it consistently across. Because then, especially if someone else comes along and tries to use their data, they're like, are these different things? If they're labeled differently, they might be different, like different types of data. Similarly, use the same units for the same variables across your different data sets if you can. So if your biomass is in grams in one, it's helpful to have it in grams in the other, or clearly laid out in your data dictionary. Another nod to consistency is now when you're starting to name files. If you're naming collections of files, it's good to try to think of some sort of scheme that will apply across them. This, again, it's a really hard thing to do. But here I have an example of these 2 different data files. We're saying that this data was collected outside, but this was inside. And we have, you know, the date in which they were collected in a consistent format, and then the variable of interest, which in this case is just biomass. So yeah, it's easy to talk about this for toy examples, but then once you start accumulating a number of data files, like sometimes you have to go back and rename because there's just more complicated stuff to think about. So again, with consistency, try to use the same file formats for similar data types. Just make it easier to work with them. Okay, so yeah, data dictionaries is something I talked about before. So yeah, you can have, for each of your data files, you can have one data dictionary per data file. Or in the case that you have all of your data files have the same columns in them and the same information generally, you could potentially have one data dictionary for all of them. And then you're also going to want to include information about the keys for your relational data files. So if you have these like multiple data files that are related, you need to record how they're related to one another somewhere. What is the linking column between them? And so our suggestion for that is to combine all this information into a README. So if you haven't heard of a README before, this is basically a document where you can put a lot of useful information about projects, including about data. And so this could be just one file. Instead of having multiple data dictionaries, you could have one file that's a README that's with your data, all the rest of your project files. And it can include sections where you have descriptions of your data sets, and then you have the data dictionaries for them, and you have keys, and then potentially a lot of other information, including like links to websites that are about your site or the collection method or what have you. And so this right here is an example of the README that's for this TerraRef project. And so you can see right down here on one of the pages, this is a data dictionary for one of the types of data. So yeah, this is an example of one of these in the real world. And so yeah, if you find yourself having a lot of data dictionaries, it might be more efficient to combine them, you know, into one big document. And that document can have other stuff in it too, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, a little bit more about collections of data files. It's a good idea to keep, I should have mentioned this earlier, but keep your raw data raw is a principle that a lot of people try to adhere by. So whenever your data is first digitized, whatever format that's in, leave that alone. Like keep that as is so that in case something happens, you can always go back to the original. And so that's your raw data without any changes made to it or any summary statistics. And so it can be a good idea to try to protect those raw data files so that somebody can't accidentally come along and like change stuff in them. But then you take those raw data files and you can go through all of these different steps to clean it. And and then produce a second data file that's your cleaned data. So along with that, this process of taking your raw data, which you should never touch after it's ready, and then getting it to the cleaned data, you want to document those cleaning steps somewhere in some way. So one of those ways is just to, within your README or within another document, you can write out the steps that you took to clean it. Sort of what we see as the next step of documenting your cleaning is to have scripts like this right here is the R script that I actually used to generate that observations data table, but like the big one. So having an actual script that then makes it more reproducible and clearer to people what steps you took when you're cleaning your data. And so yeah, like I said, a README is another place where you can include documentation for not only your data dictionaries, but also you can include what your cleaning steps were for your data files. I mean, I guess in some ways a README can kind of be a catch-all for a lot of stuff about a project. And then also, as you're doing this process of cleaning your data, you might have multiple different versions of the same data file. One of the ways to deal with that is to try to have a good naming convention for those data files as you change them. So keeping old versions of them, but having some sort of like maybe putting the date in a consistent format on the end of the name. The approach we advocate is kind of like the next step is to start using a version control system. So that basically tracks different versions of files, including data files, as you change them. And you can go back and look at previous versions and see what has changed. So we also teach workshops on how to use Git and GitHub. So if you're interested in that, you can let us know. Okay. And then, so this is kind of the big shebang of like, okay, how do you organize a project, including all of its data? Because in a project, you don't just have data files, you're also going to have, documents, you're going to have different scripts possibly to clean and analyze your data. You're going to have a lot of other information within the folder associated with any given project. And so it's helpful to think about this with a research compendium approach. This is a way of basically standardizing how you organize your projects. And so overall, the way people do these research compendiums, you have one folder per project. And so all the files associated with that project are in the one folder. And then within that folder, you'll have these sort of, probably most of the standard project subfolders. So one folder for that raw data, one folder for the clean data, maybe one for the scripts that you use to clean and analyze, maybe one for outputs like plots, maybe one for like documents, like if you have PDFs or a manuscript. And there's sort of a diagram of some of this stuff here on the right. You can see a data, they showed a data folder and an analysis folder. And it's good to be clear about, what is the data, what is the analysis, and then what are the outputs from all of that work. And then the last big thing, the thing that is, I think in some ways the hardest to do, but the most important to do is to have all this documentation for how these pieces fit together. And so, oops, sorry. All that documentation can go in a README. And so that will include things like, information about your data files and your data dictionaries and how the data are related, how you cleaned all the data. But it can also include things like what software you used, how to install things, and about the outputs too from your work. So these READMEs can include a lot of different information, which is one of the things I think makes them hard because they can be kind of project specific, but there are some general things that can be included. And so yeah, this concept of a research compendium I think is really useful. And especially like if you're trying to think about your project beyond just individual data files, but at a little bit higher level and a little more holistically, this is a great thing I think to look into. And there's lots of examples of these on the internet. So yeah, I think that's it. So now we have our complete checklist. And I envision maybe that people would actually like use this potentially and like check through this for some of their data sets and sort of use this as a way to assess where you're at. And also this is something you can take and you can add your own, different goals to it. But yeah, I'm just hoping this could be a useful framework for some people to help think about organizing their data. So yeah, and that's it. Oh, and there's a bunch of stuff about this online. There's lots of resources for all these things. I didn't make any of this up. I just put it all together in this particular format. And if you're interested in these research compendiums, there's a really good slide deck on it here. And then also a lot of other resources about it online. So yeah.
You
And
want to show folks our fall workshop series?
Oh yeah. So before we get into the data stuff, I guess I did make a nod to it and then wasn't very specific about it.
But it's actually linked together with a lot of things you said about research compendia and learning version control, all of that.
That's true. Yeah, we're teaching a lot of that. So yeah, I mentioned in the beginning that we do these like monthly workshops that are on different topics, but we also do these sort of workshop series. And so this is one that we're teaching in the fall.